Hello and welcome to the first We Swim Wild podcast. I'm Dr. Christian Dunn.
And I'm Laura Sanderson.
And in these series of podcasts, we will be looking at some of the big environmental news to hit the headlines and also trying to speak to some of the people that are involved in the environmental sector.
But in this first podcast, we're going to be updating you so far on our microplastic source to sea expedition and Waterlogger project, mapping UK microplastics. We're going to be talking about where we're up to in our adventure challenges, but also how Christian and the team are getting on in the labs.
Indeed. But first, what has been grabbing your attention in the news so far this week, Laura?
Well, it's come out in reports that there's been a catastrophic decline in freshwater fish. So the reports say that 80 species have become extinct, 16 of those in the last year alone, and 94% of the megafish population have become completely extinct.
Whoa. And is this in our rivers and in our freshwater systems?
Yeah, it's in our freshwater rivers throughout the UK. So it's hugely alarming. But what do you think are some of the kind of reasons for that? Why is that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's going to be the pollution. I think this is going to be one of the key crucial elements for this sort of story. You know, our rivers are unfortunately kind of so many of them are suffering from high levels of pollution from a huge range of different types of pollutant. And really, our rivers are indicators of how well we are looking after the rest of our landscapes, because basically everything eventually will flow into our rivers. So, you know, if we are polluting the landscapes, if we're kind of putting things down the drains that we shouldn't, then eventually that is going to hit our rivers. And then you can see the effects of this with studies like this, which are looking at kind of the amounts of fish which are being affected. And it's it's something we have to get a grip on. You know, lots of organizations are really pushing for this. There is legislation, but arguably it's just not tough enough. And the effects are, as you say, catastrophic declines in our fish numbers.
I think some of the organisations like the River Trust that are doing great work on rivers are really highlighting, and with more and more swimmers as well, highlighting that it's not just our beaches, because, you know, there's been a huge campaign about beach cleans. And I think previously, like, inland waterways were slightly neglected. And I think we're seeing that a change in that kind of mindset.
Oh, very, very much so as well. Yeah. Beaches, coastlines, you know, the sea, it's almost, I hate to say, but, you know, it's the sexy side of all this kind of environmental campaigning often. And, you know, it's vitally important that we look after it, our coastlines and our beaches. But you're right, we need to kind of be looking at inland as well. And wild swimming, open water swimming, and getting out there and swimming in the rivers. It is, I mean, we all know it's kind of more people are doing it than in the past. It's becoming more and more popular, and which can only be a good thing, not just for people's health and well-being, but also people kind of understanding the importance of our freshwater systems, our lakes and our rivers. So yeah, anything that people can do to highlight the importance of them and to look after them better as well has to be a good thing.
So what else have you been looking at? What's interested you this week in the news?
Yeah, well, the thing that's kind of really kind of I found quite interesting is the number of organizations and politicians and individuals which have got behind a campaign for state of nature. And this is to include in the environment bill, which is going through Parliament at the present time, to include in this legislation to stop the decline of natural habitats in the UK. It's often been talked about by many governments and many authorities and organizations that, you know, we have to do something to look after our habitats, our natural habitats. But unfortunately, often the legislation is not strong enough and there's not enough commitment there to actually do something about it and to stop the decline. And so it's great that this is kind of trying to be included in the environment bill. So there will be legally binding commitments there moving forwards. And I think the pandemic has really highlighted the importance to so many people how vital our natural habitats are, whether that's just a bit of green space in your local city or whether it is a national park or whatever it is. The actual importance for our well-being, for our mental and physical well-being of being able to get outside and kind of get involved in some kind of nature-based activity is absolutely essential, and we need to be doing everything that we can to protect this and make sure that it's there for future generations too.
So will this bill cover private landowners, or is it just for public areas?
It will. Well, exactly. That will all need to be discussed, what it will actually include. I'm personally hoping as well that it will involve sort of changes or improvements to developments and kind of planning permissions, so that we're bringing nature closer to everybody, really. I mean, whatever new housing development, for example, I don't understand why we're not doing everything that we can to make those new developments as nature friendly as possible. It doesn't mean massive, huge changes to the actual buildings often, but it includes things like making sure that every building has a Swift brick, every building has some B bricks. You know, there are hedges are included instead of just fences. You know, just doing everything that we can to make sure that nature is a little bit closer to all of us, and that we're doing our bit. Everybody is doing their bit to protect and increase natural habitats for wildlife and for ourselves as well.
Another article that I've seen this week is about the forest fires, about some of the trees, especially in America, not growing back after the forest fires. So previously they've grown back and they've sprouted new trees, but at the moment, all that's being covered is shrubland and grass, and they're being completely lost. And they're saying that the climate change has changed the climate in those areas so much that once those trees are gone, that they can no longer grow.
That's a really interesting story. I kind of do a little bit of work over in Florida with some of the wetlands over there. And over there, actually, wildfires, and in many parts of the world, and indeed the UK, wildfires are an essential part of succession, are an essential part of keeping that landscape going. Many trees, many plants, and indeed even kind of some animals as well, they need wildfires. It's part of their life cycle. They need it. Some plants can't germinate if there weren't wildfires. And
I think that's so well known. People immediately associate wildfires with climate change in a negative light.
Indeed, what wildfires are a natural part of our ecosystems, and so they're absolutely essential. And many habitats have adapted to coping with wildfires, but also thriving after a wildfire event. But as that report is highlighting, and as you mentioned there as well, climate change is massively affecting the severity, often the occurrence of those wildfires as well. And then obviously the climatic envelope, which allows certain species to exist where they do, is changing as the globe heats and kind of weather patterns change. So that it's inevitable that sort of areas which needed wildfires in the past, the species there won't actually be able to grow there or exist there because climate has changed completely. And so, yeah, these wildfires will then could be incredibly detrimental.
So what are your thoughts on UK planting? So obviously the trees and the whole carbon capture system, what could we be doing more of? If those areas of huge kind of forest devastation has taken place, what should we be doing as a planet?
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, you're talking about now this massive kind of push to plant so many trees in the UK, and also other countries are doing it too. And this is going to be used as a form of carbon sequestration, so carbon storage and capture. And obviously, trees are a great way to do this. However, leaving trees aside for 1 minute, just to get onto a serious hobby horse of mine, is that if we are serious about dealing with climate change and of soaking up and storing carbon, then no, don't forget about trees. However, put them aside for wetlands, especially peatlands. If we're serious about dealing with climate change, we need to get serious about sorting out our peatlands, our bogs and our fens. These are the most important terrestrial stores of carbon on the planet. Yet they cover only about 3% of the Earth's surface. Yet they store at least twice the amount of carbon that is found in all the world's forests. So our peatlands are so important.
As a whole podcast on its own, I think.
Oh, totally. So I'll stop talking. Sorry.
We'll get you back for wetlands and peatlands, I think.
So is there anything else that's been really got your attention this week, Laura?
Yeah, the work of Greenpeace, because Greenpeace have been releasing huge boulders into the sea off the coast of Brighton. And that's to stop the huge super trawlers, because so far the UK government hasn't done anything to protect our marine protected areas. So this project is about dropping huge boulders to stop the huge trawlers that are coming in and decimating the seabed. So, I mean, that's been a really interesting project. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I know it's kind of a 50-50 split. None of the super trawlers are even from the UK anyway, so I'm not sure how legislation sits with that. But Greenpeace have taken it the kind of into their own hands, and they've started doing this because the government aren't working as usual fast enough to protect these seabeds and these kind of marine life.
Well, I think this is a classic example of if the legislation isn't strong enough and people feel strong enough about it, they will take direct action. And rightly or wrongly, they will take direct action. And I think it is, the society is now changing, and we want, as a society in general, to look after our natural resources more. And I think perhaps sometimes the authorities are almost playing catch up with society with those sorts of feelings.
Yeah, I think there's more and more of that, especially Extinction Rebellion and some of the big organisations. Obviously, I'm all for the Greenpeace protests with the boulders.
That's great.
Because once these areas are lost, I mean, they're lost forever. It's like we're talking about the freshwater fish. I mean, it's not something that you can keep talking about and then, by the time, in the last year alone, we've lost 16 species of freshwater fish. I mean, these are immediate kind of concerns that need to be taken.
Totally. You've got to do something about it, I think. And if the authorities aren't doing something about it, then people will take direct action, which kind of leads us neatly on to an update about our microplastic project, because we are doing it really to highlight an issue. And we are doing it as well to kind of highlight the importance of long-term monitoring for microplastics in our inland waters, which is something that we think the government and authorities should be doing. So that was a beautiful segue into the next section of the podcast.
It was. So I don't know if you've been following this project, but way back we wanted to map one national park, Snowdon, and we swam from the top of Snowdon down to the sea to highlight the issue of microplastics, but also to test what actually looks like clear drinking water. So people always think we're looking actually at nurdles or macroplastics, but we're actually looking at microplastics, which are quite often you cannot see with the naked eye. So do you want to explain what microplastics are for the people who probably don't?
Yeah. So I'm sure I'm preaching to convert here, but we all know about the problems, the issues of plastic pollution. And I'm sure everybody here has done a beach clean, has done a river clean, has done a street clean, has go out and collects the litter. Most people here will have done, or everyone here will have done everything that they can to stop using as much unnecessary single-use plastic items. Everyone will have seen some of the images coming out of the Blue Planet, looking at the problems of plastic pollution. And these islands of floating plastics in our oceans, and obviously the actual litter that we kind of see, it is a real visual indicator of the problem. But there is an invisible side of the problem of plastic pollution, and that is microplastics. And microplastics are tiny pieces of plastics. We're talking 5 millimeters or less, so about the size of a grain of rice or less. And these are bits of plastics which, first of all, are either made to be that small. So these are called primary microplastics. And so these are kind of some types of nurdles, which are the kind of the raw, the virgin type of plastic, which get melted down to produce all other types of plastics, micro beads and kind of cosmetics. But then there's the secondary microplastics. And these are the microplastics, pieces of microplastics, which break up or off from anything that is made of plastic. So literally anything that is made of plastic will release some microplastics. And one of the biggest releases of them is our clothing. Much of our clothing has obviously got plastic fibers in it, and they release tiny bits of plastic all the time. Every time you put them in the wash, they'll be releasing thousands, tens of thousands of pieces of microplastics. And so we wanted to look at how many of these microplastics, or the concentrations of these microplastics in our rivers and our lakes. Lots has been done previously in the sea and in the ocean, but not so much at the time on our rivers and our lakes. So myself and Laura and the team want to kind of have a look at this. And this is why Laura and her crew of swimmers bravely swam from the top of Mount Snowdon all the way down to the sea and collected water samples as she went along. How far did you swim, Laura, in that swim?
I think that one was 26 kilometers, but at the top when we were planning it, we didn't think we'd find any microplastics in the top. because at that time there wasn't much research. I think the only research talking about beach cleans. So I started this project because we started Snowdonia Beach Clean, and we kept picking up a lot of plastic on the beaches. But at the same time, big companies, industry were pushing out far more single-use plastic than we could pick up. And I started to think about, kind of mopping up a bigger problem isn't the answer. So it was great for highlighting the issue to people in the general public, but then there was a lot in the media at the time about how plastics never go away, they just break down. And I wanted to kind of investigate what that meant. So they kept saying it gets smaller and smaller, that you can't see it. So I wanted to test water from Snowdon all the way down to the sea. And I remember contacting Bangor Uni, trying to find somebody. And I contacted the Ocean Science Department. There's nobody who could help me at that time. And then coincidentally, which is a stroke of luck or fate, Dr. Christian Dunn here had already been testing lakes across the UK for microplastics. And it was all over the papers that he had found microplastics in some of like the UK's biggest lakes in like quite large volumes for some of them. And coincidentally, he was up the road at my local university, and that's how this project sort of came about.
Indeed, yeah, a stroke of let's say luck. Yes, definitely luck. So how it worked was Laura swam and collected water samples as she went along, and then back in our labs we filtered those water samples. So Laura would collect like litre bottles of water, and she would filter those samples, or we would filter those samples, and then we would look at the dried filter papers under a fluorescence microscope. And then certain types of microplastics actually fluoresce. So when you're looking down a microscope at one of these filter papers, you can literally see kind of almost, they look like glowing fibers or bits, specks, sometimes just tiny specks. And if you can do some further analysis, you can test which are actually microplastics and which are organic matter. And so we found actually microplastics right at the top of Mount Snowdon, which, as Laura says, we weren't really expecting at the time, because this was a couple of years ago and there hadn't really been as much research done on this topic as there has been now. Obviously, now we know that they are in the top of Mount Everest on the bottom of the ocean, but at the time we really didn't know that. So it was really kind of, it was new data, it was new information. And
yeah,
also
I remember you saying you didn't think we'd find it at the top of Snowdon at the time. You're like, you'll find it lower down, but you probably won't find it near the top.
Exactly, yeah. So it was because it was at the time, again, it was one of the highest bits of water that had been looked at, so it was completely new. And yeah, it was a bit of a wake-up call, really, I think. Because yeah,
it gained a lot of traction in the press, that project, didn't it?
Indeed, yeah. So, but after it kind of gathered momentum, myself and Laura decided to kind of take it further. And so then Laura had the bright idea of doing another swim. And what was your plan to do with the other swimming, Laura?
The other project was to swim all 15 of the UK national parks, which is like 1,000 kilometres. And it turns out that England have 10 national parks. Well, because Wales has 3 and Scotland has 2. I thought we were kind of in those ballpark figures, but England has 10. So we're partway through that project. I started them back to back last September. We were swimming from the source all the way down to the sea to track how present they are throughout a water system. So at the source, if there's any differences between like recreational areas, urban areas as you go through, and at the source, like the mouth of the estuary. So in that project, we started in September. I swam the Pembrokeshire Cleddau, and then I moved over straight after that to swim the river in Brecon. And then I'd got ill, so it brought up a couple of different issues. So over in Pembrokeshire, I got ill from cow slurry in the water, which is a totally different issue, but it just highlights water quality in our national parks. And in fact, Brecon had areas where it was quite a putrid green colour. And when I went home and researched it, that was from high levels of chicken farming. So I think there is like other issues that need to be talked about within our national parks. So I know we've got 10-metre buffer zones, but if you've got, for example, heavy rain, and because it was a project that was back to back, I couldn't stop. So if I was just going for a swim, I wouldn't go in heavy rain. So, I mean, there were other factors at play. But I mean, all of that just runs off the land straight into the waterway. So that was a bit of a shock, because I thought there would be a lot kind of protected, a lot, kind of like more stringent.
So if I can just cut in though, and just mention my favorite topic again, or one of my favorite topics again, which is wetlands. And the problem there is that we have destroyed and damaged and got rid of so much of our riparian wetlands. So the bands of wetlands zones bordering the land and the rivers as well. And these riparian wetlands can do really good work at cleaning and treating some of this water that is running off in places like our national parks. But if we don't look after it and we've lost it, then yeah, any type of pollution is just going to run straight into the river when there's a heavy rainfall.
I was looking at research on this because wetlands work kind of in a similar way to the seagrass in that they trap microplastics also. But I saw another report that was saying that, you might want to cover some, but it was saying that microplastics, the young fish eat the microplastics that are trapped in these areas. The wildlife is eating it. So we'll probably cut this bit out, but I'm just asking you, like, where do you sit on that?
Oh yeah, totally. No, well, first of all, seagrass are a type of wetlands officially because of the kind of the water levels and the kind of the substrate and the vegetation that's there. So seagrass are a type of wetlands, and yeah, we do know that seagrass and research that we're doing at Bangor University is looking at using wetlands or the functioning of wetlands to trap microplastics, and we've shown that they can be successful both in terms of in nature, so natural wetlands, but also constructed treatment wetlands, and so it's good because basically you're then concentrating where your microplastics are, so they're not affecting potentially water systems or aquatic systems which could be potentially really damaged by microplastics. However, it is also bad because you are concentrating microplastics in these areas, so then you are, as you mentioned there, you're going to have wildlife which is feeding on them, potentially affected by them, because we don't yet know the full consequences of these microplastics. So yeah, it's good and bad, and it's one of those areas which we certainly need more research to be conducted in, because one solution could be constructed treatment wetlands could remove microplastics from our rivers. However, then all we'd be doing is concentrating the problem in a wetland. So we need further research.
I think moving on to that project, but we'll talk about it a little bit later on, like what people can do at home in terms of microplastics and reducing their impact and their use of microplastics. But moving on from that, when I started that project and we swam Wales and then we moved up to Scotland, so this is all over September. By the time we'd finished in Scotland, the coronavirus had hit, so we had to stop the project. So I couldn't move on to the Lake District in Northumberland. I think Northumberland were actually in a lockdown. So we had to think on our feet, and we decided to stop the project there. And then later this year, we'll be going back out to swim the English national parks. But you have the samples, don't you, from that project?
We do, yeah. And so we are running those now in the laboratory, and we should be getting some results about those in the next couple of months or so. So we've already kind of got them. We're kind of working through them. But unfortunately, the coronavirus has massively limited the amount of kind of people we can get working on this in the labs, my research students in the labs. But that we are got the results, and I don't want to kind of spoil any surprises. But yes, we will certainly be releasing those in the next couple of months. And unfortunately, there may well be microplastics in many of the samples that we looked at. So yes, there we go.
So we're going to start we're both actually going to swim the Lake District because we're making a film about it, aren't we?
Yeah.
So during lockdown, my fitness levels have plummeted somewhat and I've grown. So we're not doing it yet. As soon as it lifts, I need like 6 to 8 weeks of training. And then we're actually making a film about the work that we've done and the project. And yes, you are swimming part of the Lake District with me, or the whole of the Lake District swim.
Part being the operative word there. Definitely part.
But we'll see. So that'll be really exciting. And yeah, because that stopped, we wanted to continue mapping microplastics. So the original plan was to finish all the national parks last year and then launch the Waterlogger project. So the Waterlogger project, we asked over 100 swimmers to collect water from every different type of waterway that we could think of, like tarns, remote islands, urban rivers, you name it. We've probably got, I think somebody even did an underground cave.
Amazing.
Depending on the results is going to be our next project, I think. So all of those kind of results will be coming out later this year. But the idea of that is to map the levels of microplastics across the UK. Obviously, I've been doing the whole, I don't think Christian realised how many we got, but I've been doing the whole logistics of that. But the actual hard work is actually going on in the labs with a team, isn't it? Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, I mean, yeah, you did say when we started this, there will just be a few samples sent to us. And I just went, yeah, sure.
Each sample is 4 litres.
Each sample is 4 litres. And yes,
yeah.
there's many 4 litres being sent to us, which is great. Unexpected, but absolutely fantastic. I've made myself incredibly popular with the Bangor University postal team, considering that my labs are on the top of the second tallest building in Bangor. Yeah, I've really made myself very popular with them. But I do have a fantastic group of research students who are working on this, who are filtering the samples and then analysing them as well. And again, the process of analyzing them is using microscopy, so fluorescence, looking through a fluorescent microscope at them, and then physically counting them and kind of trying to categorize them as well as different types. It is a labor intensive process, so fair play to everybody that is involved in this project. They're putting in a tremendous amount of effort, and it's fantastic that so many people have got involved in sending me these samples. One of the things that we had to kind of consider was, we are running on a shoestring/no budget to do this. So we had to kind of work out a way to get the samples collected and sent to us. And the laboratory bottles, we'd have to kind of transport them back. So we actually decided, I did some previous research, again using some research students, to look at the possibility of using wine bottles, so screw top wine bottles, to collect the water samples in, which could then be transported safely to our labs in Bangor. And these screw top wine bottles work fantastically well. They don't kind of produce any kind of pollutants or anything that we kind of that mess up any results. And it also has the added benefit of being making preparation for sample collection rather enjoyable if you enjoy drinking wine. So we've got all our waterloggers to do this, and so we have been having hundreds of wine bottles sent to us, which I think again hit the national press as well, because it was rather an unusual way to hold a citizen science project.
Well, when we did Loch Lomond, we collected those in because we knew this was coming, and we knew that it was actually quite costly and not great for the environment for us to keep using like brand new bottles and posting them everywhere. So in Loch Lomond, we took the samples in wine bottles, didn't we?
Indeed, yeah.
Your whole street, your neighbours. It was a last minute project, and as we came up from, I think it was Brecon, wasn't it? Yeah. I picked up Lindsay Cole because she was on kayak, and we drove up past your house, and you raided all the neighbours' recycling bins.
I had indeed, yes, lots and lots of wine bottles. I'm not sure what that says about the people on my street, but yes, we did have a good collection of wine bottles. So yeah, it's just one of those things. It's a citizen science project. People are getting involved, and that's fantastic. So you have to kind of use what you've got, and many people have wine bottles, so it does work very well. So we've got hundreds of these sent to us, and again, my team, a fantastic bunch of students at Bangor University, are working through them, and again, we should have the initial results for that in the next couple of months, which will be fantastic to see as well. But the reason that we are doing this is because we want to map out and the whole of the UK to find out where microplastics are, or the concentrations of microplastics in every bit of water that we can kind of get someone to go and look at. Microplastics are everywhere. We kind of starting to understand that. I must stress as well, we do not yet know the full consequences of microplastics in our environments. They could be inert and not doing any damage, or they could be harmful and causing damage to ecosystems, to wildlife, and even to our own health. We just don't yet know. The research is coming out all the time on that, and we are seeing worrying signs, but we don't have any kind of definite answers to this problem yet. But
there's been research on like the mollusks that couldn't attach because of microplastics, couldn't reattach to their habitat.
Yeah, so this is the thing, we are starting to see research coming out in terms of fish being affected negatively by microplastic concentrations. So, and obviously, microplastics are 5 millimeters or less, so that is relative rice grain size. So animals are eating these, fish particularly are eating these, plankton are eating these, and that is increasing in the food chain. And we do know that plastics can leach harmful chemicals, and microplastics can also act as vectors or homes, or mobile homes, for a whole range of microorganisms, bacteria and fungi and viruses. And some of these have been shown to be harmful as well. So there are worrying signs, but we don't, and I'm going to stress, we don't yet know the full consequences of this.
This brings us back to when we were talking about the megafish, that 94% of the megafish have gone down. And I know we talked about this before, but you were saying that's because as it goes up the food chain, obviously pollution concentrates, whatever pollution that may be, and that's why we're losing the you think that's why we're losing the megafish?
Potentially, yes. So you have bioaccumulation. So, for example, if a plankton eats some or ingests some microplastic, which we know that they do, then the plankton get eaten by a bigger fish, and then bigger fish, and a bigger fish, and a bigger fish, etc., etc., etc. Then eventually, the biggest fish, the predator, the apex predator, they potentially could be eating vast amounts of microplastics or plastics, and that could be having detrimental effects to them. That's for microplastics, but for other pollutants, we know that that is definitely the case as well, this bioaccumulation effect.
This is what I've been reading. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring.
Oh, a classic, very much a classic.
Highly recommend that.
Very much.
Talking about back in the day, well, not that long ago really, about pesticides and chemicals and the water systems and the build-up. So if you haven't read it, read that. Definitely,
100%. Yeah, pesticide, I mean, it's just that bioaccumulation. It's something that we all have to be aware of. And it's one of the things that, this is why we have to look at where these microplastics are, and we have to take the issue seriously, because we can't afford microplastics to be the tobacco or the asbestos of the 21st century. We can't have it being something that we thought was great to start with, and then all of a sudden we find out it's actually having huge damaging consequences. We need, and if it is the case, if that does turn out to be right, then we need some data straight away. We can't turn back the clock and go, oh, I wish we kind of knew where all these microplastics were, or this plastic pollution was coming from. We need to know now. So if that is the case, then we can hit the ground running, and we can start doing something about it if and when, or probably when that situation arises. So it's essential that we start mapping out where our microplastics are in our UK. And it is also essential that the government and the authorities start to take this on board and start doing it as well. And I know that there are many issues there, and it is not a simple process. And I'm not saying that it should be done overnight by any stretch of the imagination. There is a lot more research that needs to go into it, but we need to start asking the questions, and we need to start doing that research ASAP, so that the authorities and the government can eventually have a widespread long-term monitoring process. We already monitor our waterways for a huge range of different pollutants, and we need to make sure that microplastics is now one of them.
I remember when we started this, we were thinking about where it was going to go, but in order to make big changes, you need to make legislative changes in order to have an impact. So this is just a stage, isn't it, in the process? So we're trying to map it all out so that then we can take that and present that as evidence. But then, there'll be a knock-on, hopefully, chain of events after that.
Very much so.
So later this year, we have those projects. I think we're looking at doing another project, which I haven't spoken to you about specifically. We'll announce it on here now. Depending on the caving results, we were going to go and swim and sample some of the deepest UK caves to see if rock filtered microplastics are that far down.
Yeah, that'll be really interesting. Really interesting.
Yeah. So that's next on the agenda. Excellent. Good to know. Good to know. I should be sending you 500 litres. That's better. So people will be listening to this and wondering, what can they do on a small scale at home to reduce their use or impact of microplastics? So I know we've talked about synthetic fibres. I know there's car tire, there's lots of different kind of areas and research being done. But what are a couple of simple things that people can do to reduce their kind of impact of microplastics at home? Yeah, well, as we said, anything that's made of plastic will break up or break off into small pieces eventually and produce microplastics. So it may sound really straightforward and really kind of basic, but the one thing that everybody can do
to stop the release of microplastics is, without doubt, use less plastic. And I will caveat this with a huge disclaimer, and that is plastic is great. Plastic is an amazing product, and it has made so many wonderful things, including healthcare, so good. For example, I wouldn't want to go into a hospital that didn't use some single-use plastic items. I wouldn't want to be having things wiped down on a lab coat before it was injected into me, for example. I think these sorts of things can be brilliant. However, what we have forgotten is that plastic is a resource, and that, like all resources, it should be used wisely and it shouldn't be wasted. And unfortunately, that is what we are doing. We are wasting so much plastic. We are using so much unnecessary plastic. So the thing that everybody can do, and it is the thing that we bang on about all the time, but it is so important, is to stop using as much plastic items, single-use plastic items. Do whatever you can to reduce the amount of single-use plastic items. That is the thing that everybody can do, and it will have an effect. Any piece of plastic that you don't need to use is going to be one more piece of plastic that is not going to end up being scattered into microplastics, maybe tens, hundreds of years down the line. So don't use plastic if you can avoid it.
I think it's just mismanaged as well, isn't it? Plastic. It was never designed to be used the way that we are currently using it. And also in terms of adventures, because I imagine lots of people are listening to this, people who go on adventures. So like you were saying, use reusables, don't use single use. But also I was reading an article about if you go somewhere, like leave no trace. So if you've taken it with you, take it home with you, and then you can dispose of it or recycle it. Even just using, the big bins that you see on like seaside fronts as stuff that gets blown around in weather and ends up in the sea anyway. So more and more people should start leaving no trace and start to take, if you've taken it out, take it back home.
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, that is, for expeditions, but just in general, I mean, hopefully that nobody listening to this podcast is the sort of person that will drop litter anyway, because I don't think they should be allowed to listen to this podcast if you drop litter, to be perfectly honest. But yeah, so obviously do not drop litter. Do not drop litter, but also, it sounds crazy, but do litter picks as well. Whether it's the beach, whether it's your street, wherever it is, do a litter pick. If you are collecting litter and that litter is then being disposed of correctly, whether you are recycling it or whether it is being taken by your local authorities, that stands a lot less chance, if it's disposed of, but to be made into microplastics or turn into microplastics, damaging microplastics further down the line, than if it was floating around your street to eventually hit the rivers and the seas, etc. So go on a litter pick up litter.
We're launching for the Water Gods campaign shortly in the next few weeks. Keep an eye out for that. It's for the waterloggers, but everyone can get involved. But within that, there'll be biodiversity studies and bird studies of the areas where people have taken microplastics to inform the academic report.
Yeah, indeed. So on top of all the microplastic analysis that we're doing, we're also trying to link it now with litter, but also biodiversity. So one of my students is going to be doing a project looking at bird biodiversity and to see whether there are any kind of connections, links, or whatever with microplastic concentrations as well. So we will be getting in touch with all our waterloggers over the next few weeks with some information about that. And if you could get involved, that would be brilliant. And obviously, if you do want to get involved, you can still do so in various ways.
Yes, which I'll talk about in a minute. But just before we move on, I wanted to mention about synthetic fibers, how you can reduce your use of kind of the amount of microplastics you're putting out at home. So I would say don't buy cheap fast fashion.
Oh yeah, totally. As you can tell, I'm a
as you can tell, we're stylish. But secondhand. 2, if you're washing your clothes, do it on a low wash. Don't wash your clothes so often, because you don't need to wash them after one use unless you've got some other problems. And wash them on a low heat, and use something like a Guppy Friend bag, which will capture some microplastics before they get released into the water system.
Oh, totally. Yeah, there are moves as well to make it compulsory that all new washing machines have a microplastic kind of filter in them, which I think is a really good idea. I think France, if I'm right, is going for this now, and it should be something that the rest of the world catches up on as well.
There is a company in the UK called Matter, and they're looking at and there's a couple of different companies. They're either looking at systems you can put into the piping system or actual machines that will actually capture microplastics. So I think 40% get through the system and end up in the ocean from the research. And
Scary.
also, I know you've talked about this before, car tires.
Indeed.
They produce a lot of microplastics, don't they? So
yeah, car tires is one of the after clothing is probably the second biggest contributor of microplastics in the ocean.
Yeah, so use the train or walk more. Yeah, those are just a couple of things I can think of.
Interesting though that by saying that, by walking more using trains, you're linking you're linking microplastics and the plastic pollution issue with climate change. And I think that is what a lot of people don't kind of get, is the fact that the two issues are connected, completely connected. So by doing one thing, by stopping using plastic or cutting down your amount of plastic, you will be having an effect of doing your bit as well to try to kind of cut down your carbon emissions as well. The two are connected often, not all the time, but they are, the two issues are very much connected.
Yeah, the oil companies that are producing all this single-use plastic, because they're losing out money on the green kind of transport initiatives, they're actually producing more and more single-use plastic, and the emissions from that is set to actually go over the emissions from the aviation industry in the next few decades, which is incredible, really.
It's scary. I mean, don't get me wrong, sometimes when you start to look at the full carbon emissions of products, plastic can be seen to be better in terms of the carbon emissions for example for transport. So glass is heavier than plastic, so if you have to transport something that's plastic, it's lighter, so it uses less carbon emissions that way. And I understand that, and so it's a trickier subject to just say the two are connected and very simply. However, I think the issue of and the longevity of this plastic pollution problem that we have needs to be really taken seriously, and it needs to be everything needs to be kind of looked at in the whole, rather than just, people often say, oh, paper bags produce more carbon than plastic, and if you're looking at kind of full lifetimes, that may be so, but the pollution issues of that plastic, that has to be taken into account.
And the leaching, for me, it's the leaching of chemicals as well, because I think there were studies. Do you remember when people would leave plastic bottles of water in their car, and on a hot day, and that they were saying that was carcinogenic, giving people cancers? I mean, you don't get that with a glass bottle. I may be wrong.
No, but I mean, with this, that's one of the issues that we know, the problems of plastic, of the fact they do leach chemicals, and so that is one of the issues that we are concerned about with the amount of microplastics that's everywhere. And in us, don't forget, microplastics are in us. Someone's estimated once that we eat we ingest a credit card sized piece of plastic every week. So we are ingesting this plastic. We know, as that research that you just mentioned there, in the previous research, has shown that plastic leaches harmful chemicals. We know that happens, and it is getting into us all the time. Take a deep breath in. You just probably inhaled some microplastics. So yes, need to do everything we can to stop using plastics when it's unnecessary.
Well, that's at the end of our first podcast.
Indeed. Thank you very much for listening.
Update. But our next podcast, we have some interesting guests. Christian will be interviewing. Who will you be interviewing?
Hopefully, if all goes well, we'll be interviewing Lizzie Daly, the BBC presenter and producer, and a very keen environmentalist and an amazing all-round person, really. And I'll be interviewing Nick Hayes, the author of the Book of Trespass, and he's going to be talking to me about the issues of wild swimming and access to land in the UK. You can get in touch with us. There are various ways to get in touch with us. Please follow us on Instagram, We Swim Wild, and we also have a website. Yeah, weswimwild.com. So you can check us out on the web. You can check us out we're mainly active on Instagram, but we're also over on Facebook and Twitter, which we are going to increase our presence on Twitter. This podcast will be available on Spotify and across all the other main podcast streams, and also on YouTube. And if you'd like to support the work that we do, if you head over to the link below where we have a Patreon link, you can click into that and help support our work. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to talking again really soon.